Okay. Sounds like you're having some great discussions. And hopefully, you're getting some ideas of how to take better care of yourself and how to make it through when times get tough. I have the honor and the privilege this morning of introducing Cheryl Jacobo. And as Jeff mentioned, yes, she's the wife of Marvin Jacobo, but she's also a graphic artist. She's been an entrepreneur. You probably noticed on your sheet there all the different degrees that she's gotten over the years. As she mentioned, she got her AA, being the wife of a youth pastor, so she learned to adapt, got her ability to adapt. She earned her MRE as the mom of two daughters, so the master of everything, ME, I guess it was, yes. And her PhD, putting hubby through college. So lots of degrees, lots of experience, but then as she's gonna share this morning, over the last few years, all of a sudden she got a mysterious illness. And if any of you guys have ever had something like that where you go to the doctor and they can't diagnose it, they don't know what it is, but you know something's wrong. And so she learned grit and tenacity to make her way through to find health and wholeness. She spoke a year ago at Inspire, our women's meeting that we have every other second Thursday. It was amazing, and I'm really looking forward to what she has to say. So come on up, Cheryl.
Thank you. Yeah. Good morning. When you hear the word grit, how many of you think of John Wayne? All right, the gray heads. Well, his character in the movie True Grit was hired to do a challenging job because of his reputation for grit. Someone thought he was up for a challenging assignment. Now, there was another man who was hired to do a job, and because of his reputation for grit, and a lot of people, including myself, knew he was up for the assignment. He did not know I was going to sneak that in. Couldn't help it. In 2014, Marvin took the helm of City Ministry Network, and at the time he had a very sick wife. Losing your health is something no one signs up for, but I guess somebody thought I was up for the assignment. I'm going to be talking about grit, and as I share my story, I want you to think about your threshold for discouragement and how you lead yourself when you have to face difficulties that are forced upon you. According to Angela Duckworth, grit is defined as passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. Grit is having stamina. It's sticking with your future day in and day out, not just for the week, not just for the month, but for years, and working really hard to make that future a reality. Grit is living life like it's a marathon, not a sprint. She also says that grit is a better predictor of success than having high IQ. And I think Einstein agreed when he said this: "It's not that I'm so smart, it's just that I stay with the problem longer." I happen to like this definition. 10 years ago, this month, October 2008, I had a surgery that was botched. I woke up knowing that there was something very wrong, and I never recovered from that surgery. From that point on, I started a steady decline in my health. I was extremely fatigued with migrating pains in my muscles and joints. I had daily headaches and brain fog and little stamina. And these symptoms progressively worsened over time. I knew the major turning point was that surgery, but doctors could not connect my new symptoms with it. For 6 years, I went to over 20 different healthcare providers, trying to find relief, trying to find answers, and no one could give me any. Of course, there were guesses. You have adrenal fatigue, you have chronic fatigue syndrome, you have fibromyalgia, you have a hole in your head. And Dr. Google just always told me I was dying. But Dr. Google did help me research and learn some dramatic ways to take control of my health and make some lifestyle changes, some which were suggested by doctors, including completely giving up sugar in all forms, and giving up dairy, and giving up gluten, and a whole bunch of other fun foods. I only ate food that would be medicine for my body. And I could end my talk right here, because that took a lot of grit. I was very committed to supporting my body and giving it every chance to do what it could, what it was designed to do, which was to heal and take care of me. Sometimes grit requires that you take responsibility to learn and grow and change in dramatic ways. Now, when I couldn't return to my full-time job, I was put on disability, and then I was dropped because I didn't have a definite diagnosis. I had a mystery illness. So on top of my growing physical dysfunction and the frustration of not being able to get answers from doctors, we also had financial challenges because of my loss of income on top of the medical bills. After exhausting my options within conventional medicine, I went looking outside the box to unconventional medicine. And all of that was out of pocket. And so after a few years, without any progress, we ran out of pockets. I was continually between a rock and a hard place. On one side, what doctor can I go to for help? And then if I found one, how are we going to pay for this? Doctors did agree that I was very sick. And eventually my weakness and inability to think straight caused me to give up a lot of things, including cooking and driving, and I became homebound and isolated. Even talking on the phone hurt my brain. I just had survival tasks. Take my meds, eat, sleep. It's extremely challenging to advocate for yourself when your head is in fog and your body's in pain and your pockets are empty. And yet, somehow, in spite of all that, I stubbornly kept jiggling doorknobs till I could find a door to open to the answers I needed. Grit is relentless in reaching its goal. It doesn't make excuses, whine, blame, rationalize, and it doesn't play the victim. Now, don't I sound tough? The truth is that I did feel like a victim because none of this was my fault. And you know, chronic pain can do crazy things to your headspace. I don't know if you've ever been so discouraged and so depressed that you can't even cry because you're just numb. That's where I was more often than not. But I believe God gave me a tactic that helped me maintain my grit. I had realized that after every doctor appointment, I would go into this black hole of depression and overwhelm with everything that was wrong in my life. And I'd be held captive in this pity party for way too long. So I gave myself permission to have that pity party, but just for one day. I would announce to my family and friends that after every doctor appointment, I was going to have a pity party day, and the only ones invited were me, myself, and I. And somehow by the next day, or 2 or 3, I would regain a bit of determination. Sometimes grit needs a break to recalibrate. Finally, I found a clinic in the Bay Area that specializes in tick-borne diseases. I had never heard that phrase, had no idea what it meant, but it means diseases caused by a tick bite. And in January 2015, I was finally diagnosed with Lyme disease. I remember having tick bites as a child, and 2 different specialists have agreed that I probably had this infection since childhood. My immune system had been strong enough to keep that infection in check until the time of that botched surgery 40-some years later, and then my immune system lost the battle. So that surgery was a trauma to my body that became a tipping point. Now, Lyme disease is called the great imitator because it mimics many other diseases. Complicating it further is the fact that there are secondary co-infections that go along with it. And these are different for every patient, which explains the different manifestation of symptoms. No 2 Lyme patients are the same. Lyme is very complex, and it's very destructive, and it can take a life. And something quirky about Lyme is that most people who have it never look sick, which makes it easy to be dismissed. So after 6 years of looking, I was finally relieved to have a name to my problem. I didn't know it, but I was equally terrified. I didn't know anyone who had this disease. I had no idea what I would be facing. But what I had to face was a lot worse than just having Lyme. Before starting treatment, the Lyme specialist did a screening test for mold toxins, explaining that if I had been exposed to mold, it would tremendously complicate my treatment. It's the worst thing that can happen to someone with Lyme. And sure enough, I had high levels of mold toxins in my body. Since I had been homebound, there was only one place to look for the exposure. The mold was growing without any visual evidence in the entire length of our bedroom wall, with the highest concentration right where my head was every time I laid in bed, which was the majority of day and night. Do you think this can get any worse? I happen to be allergic to mold. This explained why only I was symptomatic, but not Marvin, because I had a moldy brain. Do you think this can get any more challenging? After the remediation was finished of that exterior wall, we found out our home insurance wasn't going to pay a penny of it. We had this volcano of debt, and we're in its shadow, and it's going to consume us. And yet, somehow, in spite of all that, I had to move forward. I started the multi-layered treatments for all my infections, and it really became complicated, and I had severe reactions. So after a few months, my doctor decided I was too frail, and I was too overloaded with infections to tolerate the oral protocol. So now what do? Her first option was to have us rent a hotel room near her clinic so I could go to her office 4 days a week for IVs, and then I'd go home for 3 days. I would have to repeat this every week for up to 12 months. The second option, if I could find a local infectious disease specialist to insert a PICC line in alternating arms every week, she would design the protocol so I could manage the IVs on my own at home. This weekly treatment would take as long as 18 to 24 months. And she thought the second option would be easier on me. In my overwhelm, God dropped a question in my head, and I asked her, if money was not an issue, how would you treat me? And the next thing I know, she's talking about how restrictive California health laws are, meaning there were treatments I needed, but I couldn't get them in California. I'm like, are you kidding me? State laws are an obstacle to me getting well? So even though neither of those options seemed doable, we did find one, and only one, infectious disease specialist in our area who was open to having a conversation with me. But when I met with her, she said, you do not have Lyme disease. It doesn't exist in California. Well, I beg to differ. I had just come face to face with the politics surrounding Lyme disease, and I had actually been encountering it all along. I just didn't know it. While chronic Lyme disease continues to become an epidemic, the medical community is arguing over whether it even exists. And this is the reason that most tests and treatments are not covered by insurance. So on top of state laws, politics was another obstacle to my long-term goal of getting well. It had been such a long, painful battle, and I had hit too many walls. And this was the point where I felt the most despair. And I found out you can run out of grit. That perseverance to keep going, it can dry up. I was declining so fast that I began to be afraid that I was dying, and I began to wonder if I should just cooperate with that decline instead of fighting it. And this is when the Calvary showed up. City Ministry Network has this incredible board of directors, and Marvin was with a few of them when they asked how I was doing and how he was doing. And with that update, the suggestion came up that I needed people to come and pray for me and for our whole family. And so within a few days, Marvin made that happen. I sat in the middle of our living room on a Thursday evening, and our friends surrounded us and prayed Mayday prayers on our behalf. And this is what's called surrogate grit. I had run out of grit, and others came alongside me and gave me theirs. This wasn't the first time that others had shared their grit with me over those 6 years, but it was one of the most profound. And there is no way I would be standing here if not for the grit that others gave me. One of the far-fetched ideas we shared with our praying friends was going to a clinic in Arizona that specialized in chronic Lyme disease. But for us to consider that option, we were going to need at least $80,000 for a minimum of 8 weeks of treatment, all out of pocket. We also shared that a lot of Lyme patients all over the country were doing these online fundraisers, so maybe I could do that. The following Monday, I had another appointment with the Lyme specialist to decide what to do, and she agreed I needed to go to this clinic in Arizona. This was definitely an answer to our Thursday night prayers. So after that doctor appointment, an email was sent to our praying friends telling them we had the what figured out. Now we had to wait and see how God would figure out the how, because it was so beyond us. And this is the fun part of the story. 20 minutes after that email was sent, Marvin got a message from one of our friends asking if we could FaceTime with them, which I thought was kind of odd. But they really wanted to see the look on our faces when they told us that they believed I needed to go to Arizona as soon as possible. And to help us out, they wanted to give us an interest-free loan that we could pay back whenever we could. That loan was for $80,000. They had thrown down a rope into that deep hole that I had fallen into. And I found out that hope is what fuels grit. So $80,000 shows up in 20 minutes, and we hadn't even put the online fundraiser up. We hadn't even really done the math. So when Marvin added up the estimate from the clinic, our living expenses and travel expenses for ourselves, as well as for the friends we were going to need to come help us out, it came to $100,000. And then someone advised us, who's experienced in grand-scale fundraising, to raise that by 20% for unforeseen contingencies. Sure, what's another 20 grand to raise? So we did the next hard thing, and we put that fundraiser up. Imagine you have no resources, and you are sitting on the roadside with a cup in your hand, begging for mercy. And this is what it felt like to ask for people that we knew and people we didn't know to pay for my treatment. It was very, very humbling. There are many of you in this room that contributed, and I'm not going to look right now because it'll make me cry, but I want to say thank you for your mercy. Sometimes grit requires a shameless vulnerability. I mentioned that we were going to need friends to come help us out. We were told that caregiving itself was pretty intense, and we were going to need 2 people there. So along with my husband, 9 different women were recruited to take turns staying with us to cook, shop, clean, run errands, pray, and cheer us on. Now let me stop and say this right now. All of this was happening very fast for my very slow brain. Everything felt completely out of my control as others stepped in to make this huge undertaking happen. God was raising up an army to help us, and you would think that would give me peace of mind, right? I was having a wrestling match with anxiety, and this is what was going on in my head. I have not earned the right to this kind of help. I don't deserve any of this. I don't want to bother all these people. It's too much of a sacrifice for others to make. If it had been my husband or my children who were sick, none of those thoughts would have been in my head. Of course, they're worth the bother. Of course, they deserve help. But I did not value myself to the same degree. I had no idea that another obstacle I would be facing was self-sabotage. I struggle with wanting to give up and talk myself and everyone else out of doing this crazy, dramatic thing. And as sick as I was, and with God's help, I had to figure out why I was so resistant at that point, because it certainly wasn't because I didn't have support. And emotionally, this meant I had to stand down. I had to stand still. And I had to sit with all those uncomfortable feelings and figure it out. And then I had to get my beliefs in alignment with the truth of what God says about me, which is another way of saying I had to own my stuff. And then, before I could move forward, I had to give up control. It's a very scary thing to do, but I gave in to the process and I went with it. Sometimes having grit means being emotionally honest and accepting what's beyond your control. Now, 30 days after that prayer time, in our living room, we were on our way to Scottsdale, Arizona. My treatment took 11 weeks. And let me tell you, my grit had to show up every day of that treatment. It was very hard walking into the clinic every morning knowing I was going to be tortured. And I even saw other patients there give up and go home because it was that ruthless. But those 9 women and my husband, they were vital in keeping me going. Sometimes grit is just showing up, squaring off, and standing your ground. when we walked out of the clinic on the very last day. Our bill, which was a little over $120,000, it was paid in full. And within 18 months, that loan from our friends was paid back. Many of you were a part of a miracle, and how fun is that? Today, nearly 3 years later, I still have a struggling immune system, and I have side effects from being sick for so long, but I am in remission from Lyme disease. Grit taught me, and God, that I'm a lot tougher than I've ever given myself credit for, and I'm here telling you, so are you. Grit showed me my huge capacity for change, and you have that capacity too. Grit gave me the confidence of a conqueror, and you can have that confidence too. And grit has humbled me by revealing how desperate I am for community. We all really do need each other. Grit is never just for your benefit to get you through a tough time. It is for the benefit of those watching you and following you. Now, I don't believe you can have grit without having a big why. There has to be a reason for persevering and pushing forward and doing the hard thing. And of course, my love for my family was overwhelmingly my greatest motivation. But my real, deep down in my soul, why power was and is Jesus Christ. I love him so much, and there is no story here without him. He knows a thing or two about grit, and he has an endless supply of it. And whenever I have come to the end of myself, which was often, he was always there, and his love for me is what really got me through. This is really everybody's story here, because this was not a solitary story with one person in it. And I want to thank you for your part in it, and thank you for letting me share it with you.